context using 2,200 volunteers convicted of various crimes who were recently released or nearing release from 4 different states. Participants engaged in the behavioral health-centered program by working with a 5-key practitioner, a social worker type professional that has been trained in the implementation of the model and works with researchers to help each participant address and overcome the unforeseen issues created after release as they occur. The practitioner works with participants both before and in the years after release to address core behavioral concerns, overcome complications, and celebrate the achievements as they happen. The approach has been an overall success, with the former prisoners from the sample size having significantly lower rates of reoffense and recidivism compared to their peers who did not undergo the program. The success of the sample size that underwent the program has led to the research and its implementation moving into the next phase for implementation on a wider scale. Although the program has not been implemented to a point where it can be deemed as a foolproof solution to the issue of recidivism, its evidence-based research and peer-reviewed implementation have added validity to the efficacy of a multi-step approach to recidivism. Personally, what I like so much about this model is that unlike other programs for rehabilitation, it can be applied to people of such widely different circumstances and can be adapted and individualized to the unique needs of each participant. So something that, if we're talking about the issue of rehabilitation, I wanted to look at this through both lenses to make sure that I was being as unbiased as possible, and that involves addressing an inconvenient truth. Through the majority of the process leading up to my presentation here today, I was and still am predominantly focused on helping inmates lead productive lives and reducing the overall situation of recidivism in the United States. I'm a huge advocate for restorative justice and a supporter of the idea that even some of the most flawed human beings can change. However, I realized that in order to ensure that I was not working towards a conclusion made from my own bias, I must look at all of the facts, regardless of whether or not they fit my preconceived notions about criminal justice. The progression of my research led to the realization that there was more nuance to this issue than I was initially willing to consider. As someone with family members who have suffered from drug addiction, I realized that you cannot help someone who is unwilling to help themselves. And as I came to realize, this same idea is applicable to criminal rehabilitation. On one hand, I am in favor of helping those who can be helped, but on the other hand, I realize that there are inmates who lack self-accountability and the drive to genuinely make productive changes in their lives, even with exposure and access to resources that would enable them to do that. I believe those inmates that are given these opportunities and just don't take advantage of them, quite frankly, probably deserve harsher sentencing. Statistics from the Vermont legislators show the nuance of criminal reform by displaying that out of 879 first-time court diversion participants in Vermont, only 6 would go on to reoffend, whilst out of 174 court diversion participants who underwent the same program but had a past of criminal activity, over 86% would reoffend. The reality is that there are repeat criminal offenders who are unwilling to take advantage of any opportunity presented to them, and ultimately their presence in public life and ability to continuously reoffend not only prolongs the suffering of their families and those who love them, but the overall community as well. I further realize this inconvenient truth in my quest to gain insight from someone with actual experience in the field of law enforcement, which led to my interview with Mr. Richard Layton. Here at the Academy, he is a safety officer, but prior to his job here, he worked as a police officer for 23 years, starting as a patrolman in Hardwick, Vermont, eventually being promoted to detective, becoming a police captain, and then serving the St. Johnsbury community during his final 8 years in law enforcement as the chief of police. I was very fortunate to have the opportunity to talk to such an experienced member of law enforcement and gain their insight. Mr. Layton told me that during his time in law enforcement, up to half the people he arrested were addicted to drugs of one kind or another, and in his initial years as a patrolman, he described himself as naive and wanting to see everyone go to jail. He realized over time, though, that there are people that would genuinely not benefit from going to jail, and they would benefit more so from receiving help for their underlying issues that were causing their criminality. He recalled one instance where a woman he had arrested numerous times who was addicted to heroin received help for her addiction and was able to turn her life around and become the manager of a restaurant as well as a beloved member of the community. Mr. Layton, however, acknowledges that these success stories, although possible, are not always the case, and many people make no effort to reform their criminal lifestyle. He explained that Vermont has a lax criminal justice system, in his opinion, that continues to release repeat offenders, ultimately contributing to more criminality in the community. My conversation with Mr. Layton and the progression of my research led to an overall understanding that I cannot in good conscience advocate for the reduction of recidivism through the rehabilitation of those who are willing to be helped without advocating for the protection of the public from those who cannot. So I've said a lot, and I want to kind of summarize what I've said and highlight some key takeaways from this. Something I want to mention is that the polarization of politics in the United States has turned many potentially meaningful conversations into two-sided clashes that interfere with the implementation of proper education and change. The reality is that recidivism is a problem that affects a diverse range of communities in both red and blue states. Since the beginning of my research, my aim was not to approach the topic of recidivism from a conservative or liberal perspective, but rather from the angle of a genuine, open-minded attempt at making some sense of a vastly complex issue. When I had envisioned my ultimate goal for this project and how I could manifest a semester's worth of research into a meaningful but realistic end result, I did so with the understanding that I am one high school student and that I alone will not be able to find a definitive solution to an issue that policymakers and criminal justice advocates have worked at solving for decades. Ultimately, I realized that an important result that I could achieve with the resources that I had was one of education. I wanted to educate a room full of people, all of you, about the nuanced facts of such an important issue, facts which are mainly ignored in the vast discussions of the greater American political system. With this presentation, I have some core ideas that I want you to take away from this. First of all, for some of you, this might be the first time hearing this word. Recidivism describes the tendency for formerly incarcerated individuals to be sent back to prison after their initial release, whether it be for new crimes or parole violations. Recidivism is caused by multiple factors that are individualized to each case. Recidivism is an important issue as it pertains to the safety of American communities and the use of American tax dollars. Recidivism is a solvable issue as made evident by success stories like that which was seen in South Carolina. Research has created a framework for solving this problem by addressing multiple variables simultaneously as new rehabilitation models are consistently being developed. People are capable of tremendous change, and just because the circumstances of someone's life have put them on the wrong path, they can still be guided in a direction that allows them to do good for themselves and their communities. In the end, I realized that a good portion of the people in this room may not care about this problem and are probably not even old enough to vote. But that won't always be the case, and if I, a singular high school student, am able to educate even just a room full of people, or a room full of future voters, I should say, about such a complicated but pressing issue, then in my opinion, I've succeeded. Thank you.
Hi. I was wondering, I remember seeing a prison system in, I think it was Sweden, don't quote me on them though, that had an incredibly low reincarceration rate. I was wondering if you looked at some prison systems in other countries. You mentioned the one in South Carolina, but I was wondering if you looked at some prison systems in other countries that have a low reincarceration rate to see if that could be applicable to America.
Yeah, so countries like Sweden and Norway come up a lot in like these conversations. They go by what's referred to in America as the Scandinavian model for prisons, and their prisons work extremely well in their respective countries, but there are major cultural differences and differences in the types of crime that are being committed in these countries compared to the United States. So I don't think it's something that we can necessarily take and totally apply here. I do think we could take bits of it to use for inspiration as to how we can adapt our prison system. But those countries, they're doing really well where they are. I just don't know if it could be applied here per se.
Thank you.
I did look into equine therapy for prisoners. It seems to work really well, but it's not being implemented on such a scale where, when I'm talking like a national context, the numbers don't have enough significance yet. I think it would be greater to start implementing it more and more, and then we could see how effective it is. But it looks pretty promising right now.
Have you seen a difference in recidivism between different types of crime, like non-violent crime versus violent crime?
So yeah, actually, and for some reason, and even a lot of researchers can't exactly pinpoint why, the type of crime that is more likely to be repeated actually varies by state. So in Alaska, I found that, like, for example, sex offenders have some of the lowest rates of recidivism in Alaska, when that number is some of the highest in other states. So that question, to answer it, it would be on a state-by-state basis, and it just varies. Hmm. So in policing, or people of color have disproportionate amounts of incarceration in this country, and some sources I read say that for recidivism rates, that is also disproportionate, which I believe can be attributed to the disproportionate rate of arrests. I think that that is such a big and complex issue that it deserves a project of its own, which I wasn't able to get to today, but it's definitely incredibly important, and that ties more back to like incarceration and policing as a whole, less about recidivism, but yeah. So not local, but I had a conversation with Mr. Rayla, who works in the counseling department, and he worked for the the Denver prosecutor's office to work on, or he implemented restorative justice programs, specifically with juveniles. So I didn't have time to fully cover my interview with him, but I was able to kind of tell him what I was saying or what I was going to say, and see if that kind of matched his experiences while he was working as a restorative justice practitioner. And he explained to me some key ideas, how, like, something I learned from speaking with someone that was actually incarcerated that matched what he was saying was that showing someone the human impact of what they had done is actually a pretty effective way at kind of acting as the catalyst for making them want to change. Like, for example, he would sit offenders down with their victims when they were ready, and the victims would tell them how what they had done had affected them. And for many, that would kind of act as the catalyst for wanting to make productive changes in their lives. But yeah, that was the only restorative justice practitioner that I had a chance to speak to.
I was just wondering what you think the delay is for implementing systems like the South Carolina one. I understand that you talked about like our political polarization, but I was wondering if it would also be difficult financially to implement in like prison systems because of like higher amounts of jobs needed. Is that an issue also?
So it does have a financial cost to implement these programs, but the cost of recidivism itself and keeping people incarcerated vastly outweighs that. And overall, a state like South Carolina saw a $500 million decrease over, even with the cost of their programs taken into account. So there was, it made more financial sense to implement these programs as opposed to not implementing them. So I found that housing and economic circumstances were probably the greatest predictors of that. A lot of the reasoning behind why someone will go commit a crime again comes from firsthand accounts. Like, you can't objectively figure out why this person went and did what they did. They have to tell you that themselves. And through reading research reports that conducted numerous interviews, it would seem that housing and economic reasons account for the greatest cause. Something else I found that I didn't get to mention was that a lot of prisoners after being released will go through halfway houses, and a lot of halfway houses they'll be placed with other felons who, in many cases, will be selling drugs out of the halfway houses. And for someone, let's say, suffering from addiction, which had motivated some of their crime, it's a horrible environment for them to be in because they're being enabled again to get hooked again on what had initially caused them to commit crime. I can't predict the future. I don't think that the American culture would have to change to such a great extent that I don't think something like that would ever be able to be implemented in my lifetime. But I think we can, as American culture does change and the reasonings for people committing crimes does change, I think we can take more and more aspects of that and apply it to our current justice system.